Adolf Hitler was not the only person trying to overthrow German democracy. He was just the most psychotic person trying to overthrow German democracy. German democracy was in trouble from day one.
Welcome to the future of our former democracy. I'm Heather Villanueva.
And I'm Colin Cole.
We're here to talk about democracies, what works, what doesn't, and how we might be able to improve our own system here in the U.S. by learning from other countries. Our democracy is an elected representative democracy.
That's right. That's what people mean when they say, oh, we're actually a republic. They mean we're an elected representative democracy.
We don't, as a people, vote on our bills. We elect people to vote on bills on our behalf.
And we all know where our democracy comes from. It comes from the founding fathers. We fought this revolutionary war. We do the Boston Tea Party. We use guerrilla war tactics. We break all the rules. And the British Redcoats, they don't know how to respond to this American exceptionalism and the way that we do things differently, our own way.
Yeah.
And we're going to go out there. We build something unprecedented, a democracy in the Western world, something that had never been done before.
We were so smart. We thought of everything. Separation of powers between Congress, the judicial branch, and the executive branch.
We come up with the Electoral College, our perfect compromise between representing people and states that won't give the people too much power, and we use it to elect our presidents ever since. And, you know, we're the greatest country in the world.
Do you think we're being too sarcastic here, Colin?
Well, maybe. But I think a lot of people are unironically taught this. When I think back to my 4th, 5th, 6th grade history class, this is basically what I learned about the U.S., just without the sarcasm, but I think that actually kind of makes it worse. This story we tell ourselves, this myth, papers over a lot of reality, and it makes it sound like the founding fathers got everything right the first time. We should always think about the founding fathers' intent, and we just have this democracy. It just popped into existence 200 years ago.
But it was really white land-owning settlers who were fed up with taxation without representation from the British colonies, and they fought a war to achieve a version of democracy that would work for them. And they're like, by the way, can we have some slaves? And also we have to get rid of the indigenous people. So there's a real actual lived history that we have in the United States. And we have the story that we tell ourselves about how we created our Constitution and our democracy. But, you know, we talked about what our origin myth is. What is the origin myth for Germany?
Instead of me telling you, I'll let our friend Bobby Gramp, who is a tour guide at the German Bundestag's exhibition on parliamentary history, tell you.
How did Germany become interested in democracy? Let us say that Germany was infected with the ideas of the French Revolution, with sort of modernism via Napoleon. Everything in modern German history originates with the Napoleonic occupation of the German states. So what happened at that time was, on the one hand, basically the attempt to get rid of Napoleon, and at the same time, in a way, those new ideas of the French Revolution remained stuck in the heads of Germans. So they wanted to have these new things as well. Civic liberties, the classic liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and so forth. But also they were striving for parliamentary representation. They got rid of Napoleon, but they wanted to have these modern ideas for themselves. And in a way, you could call it the beginnings of German democratic history.
It is really striking to think of how relatively new democracy is as a system in Germany, stretching back only to 1918, a bit over 100 years ago. And the first version of German democracy was a spectacular failure with the rise of Hitler and Nazi fascism just a few years later. In this episode, we're going to focus in on that time period, how Germany's brand new democracy was able to be taken over by a brutal far-right movement.
And not only is German democracy fairly young, but the entire conception of Germany as a country is fairly young. It was a collection of 41 different kingdoms and territories that were meaningfully different from each other. Most of them spoke German, but not all of them. I think when you think of Germany, you might picture old castles in an old European country like France or England that's been around for centuries. But that's not the case in Germany. In fact, the Republic itself wasn't declared until 1918, like you said, at the end of the Great War, the war to end all wars.
World War I actually ends right with this building.
It was a really bright, cold February morning when Martin Lang toured us through Berlin.
It is a very snowy day. It's not snowing, but it's so cold that the snow from days ago it has no chance to melt away. So we're walking through the snow.
Each step through the city revealed more layers of this complicated story. It's actually interesting because Berlin isn't laid out in chronological order. So as you walk through the city, you sort of have to grapple with, well, here's something that happened in World War II, here's something that happened 20 years ago, here's something that happened 200 years ago. We're going to try to help rearrange this to be a bit more chronological for you. And at this point, we're standing in front of the imposing Reichstag building, which is essentially the German capital equivalent of the U.S. legislative building, the U.S. Capitol.
Yeah, with all the construction in front of the Reichstag, the best view is actually here if we go a little further up here from the side that's relatively unobstructed.
It houses their national parliament, which is called the Bundestag, and it's the place where democracy began in Germany.
I'm pointing out here that on the 9th of November 1918, when the Kaiser abdicated.
Okay, and Kaiser means emperor, so the Kaiser was the monarch of Germany.
It's difficult. If people don't know what democracy is and that democracy takes time and you're coming out of a war and the Versailles Treaty set up by, Americans, Brits and French, but mostly by the Brits and the French, you're now forced to pay huge war reparations and deal with a lot of other restrictions on the military and give up land and all that. People have a hard time dealing with that new system, democracy, and this is exactly what we see here in the Reichstag. Over that Weimar Republic period, we're looking at new elections every year. Between 1 and 3 times, we have elections every year. People don't trust all these elections. People don't even know who to vote for because there's way too many parties to choose from, right? And in peak situations, we have up to 17 political parties in the parliament, right? People don't even know who is who. Over these 13 years, we have 12 different chancellors between 1919 and 1932. It's an absolute mess, not exactly a system that provides the stability that people would have really needed after World War I.
If folks want to get sort of a sense for the flavor of how Berlin was wild in those days, we can heavily recommend the musical Cabaret.
I like those parties. Truth is, I like this whole city. It's so tacky and terrible. Everybody's having such a great time. If this were a movie, do you know what would happen? There'd be a tidal wave or a volcano would erupt.
Well, maybe you should write for the cinema.
I recently actually just learned about Cabaret, and I was pleasantly surprised by how interesting and vibrant and expressive folks were able to live. Berlin was an arts capital. It also became one of the freest cities in terms of sexual expression. And it was a center for the research that laid the foundation for understanding who we now call queer, trans, and gender nonconforming folks. Certainly, the musical Cabaret makes it seem like Berlin was hot shit before the rise of the Nazis.
Interesting that you mentioned that, because we actually visited the building that British author Christopher Isherwood lived in during those heady Weimar days. He wrote Goodbye to Berlin, which would later become adapted into Cabaret. And it really does seem like Cabaret was not an exaggeration, that it was a pretty accurate encapsulation of sort of the vibe of the city back then. Dr. Finn Ballard, a historian and one of our tour guides in Berlin, took us on a walk through Schönenberg, the longtime gay capital of the city, sort of like Capitol Hill here in Seattle.
They'd like to say we were never here. We just appeared in the last couple of decades. It's just preposterous, That's what Berlin in the 20s was all about. We'll talk about that as we go.
Finn, who's a trans man from the north of Ireland, has lived and worked in Berlin since 2009. He told us about the first person who really began the work of developing basic understanding and scientific acceptance and normalizing of the diversity of sexual and gender expression, who was a man named Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld.
He will really flourish in the Weimar era when he can get his own gigantic headquarters in the middle of Berlin, the Sexual Science Institute. So here was the first doctorate in all the world who'd be operating on trans people, who'd be really advocating for gay rights, campaigning against the criminalization of homosexuality, because his campaign was always about transparency and openness and decriminalization.
I guess one of the points here is that Berlin, after World War I, was really this hotspot for new ways of understanding the world, both politically and socially. They were becoming aware of the water that they swam in. And this gay neighborhood of Schöneberg still has this really vibrant feeling, which stems from being such a long-time epicenter of the queer community. Just walking around, you have LGBTQ art galleries, you have fetish clubs, you have pride flags in the windows and hanging from buildings, you have beautiful murals that are clearly trying to still challenge ideas of gender norms, and it's still there today.
And that goes back to this question too of how this all evolved. It was just a number of very strident and very dynamic people getting together and making space for themselves, carving it out for themselves. But that was facilitated, at least in some part, by the fact that in the 1920s, anything was possible in Berlin, it seems.
It sounds like this cabaret-like explosion of expression came from this feeling of having been so repressed and oppressed and having to live inside these rigid boxes. And now people were suddenly able to, and not just able to, but were forcing their way into self-expression as a way of finding radical acceptance for themselves and their communities and carving out space for themselves. And that all existed because they were tossing away the old ways as the result of the end of World War I. So now here are people where after these kingdoms fell and democracy has started to rise, people are really feeling a sense of liberty, but feeling hope and liberty. So these kingdoms fell and democracies rose, but Finn cautioned us not to over-romanticize this Weimar era.
The Kaiser had abdicated his throne and fled to the Netherlands. The whole German Empire had collapsed. All of these new political movements were fermenting, from the communists to the Nazis and everything in between. There was a strong feminist movement. Finally, women had the vote. 52 female MPs in the German parliament in the first election after the abdication of the Kaiser. So it was a moment in which the vacuum that had been created at the end of World War I was a space into which all kinds of new movements could shift, let's say. But it only lasted 15 years, then it was all over in the most horrendous way possible.
What are you talking about?
Leaving Berlin as soon as possible, tomorrow.
We love it here!
Sally, wake up! The party in Berlin is over. It was a lot of fun, but it's over. And it's gonna get a lot worse.
So I would say we tend to be maybe a little bit too idealistic when we look back to the 20s and the golden period of the Weimar era. There was a lot of suffering here as well. I've been translating letters for one of my tourists whose grandfather was here 100 years ago. And he's talking about going out for champagne reception and then on the way home seeing people frozen to death in the gutters. So many people were so poor, don't forget.
I think Finn really raises an important point here. Sure, Berlin post-World War I can be seen as this free, wild party city, but overall, people in the city and the whole country are reeling from the loss of the war. People are suffering.
It also is really tied up in this Treaty of Versailles, the peace treaty that formally brings World War I to an end. It requires this brand new Germany to pay back an enormous amount of war debt, reparations, to the countries that it lost the war to. And because it is in so much debt, the new German government now just can't provide for its people. And it's in this context where we also have this chaos of so many elections and so many new political parties, people trying to decide, like, what should the future of Germany be? It's this 1-2 punch of economic collapse following World War I, combined with a brand new democracy that leads to further instability.
If you now throw in hyperinflation in 1923, 4 marks used to buy you $1 before World War I. Now in 1923, in early November, it's $4.2 trillion marks for the dollar, right? This is, German savings go down the drain. People turn to the extreme, right? In 1929, even more so, world economic crisis hits us pretty heavily. And this is exactly where we go up to 5 and then later 6 million unemployed by 1932. And in that year, 1932, we have 2 elections here. So in the first election, 1932, in the summer, we already have a pretty difficult result of the election. That's where we see the Nazis. And by that, I don't just mean Hitler's NSDAP Nazi party. We're talking about a blob of right-wing extremist parties, completely anti-democratic on the right end of the political spectrum, of which the Nazi party of Hitler is the strongest force, right?
Okay, let's pause here for a second. History moves quickly at times, and I want to make sure we get this right. So Germany, the new republic, formed in 1918 and has a chaotic parliamentary system that struggles to actually govern effectively. And saddled with enormous war debt and the Wall Street crash of 1929, Germany is seeing hyperinflation and unprecedented unemployment. Into that power vacuum steps Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist or Nazi Party.
Yeah, with some asterisks attached. Hitler isn't from Berlin, and he's not even from Germany. He's an Austrian. He fought in World War I, and now, post-war, he's hanging down south in Munich. So let's take a moment to step back in time, before the Wall Street crash, to the years just after the end of the war, so we can better understand some of the wider political context that allowed that financial crisis to be even more devastating to Germany's democracy, and to better understand Hitler's rise in Bavaria. That's where our learning tour began, actually. So we're going to go ahead and leave Weimar Berlin for a little bit and travel down to the old beer halls of Munich, the place where politics is playing out at a very local level. Our tour guide there, Brennan McGurk, is also from Ireland, and he's also lived and worked in Germany for many years. He walked us through the medieval streets of the walled city, Old Town Munich.
The center of Munich is largely pedestrianized and largely walkable, so we'll be getting away from traffic lights and building sites and busy roads.
Munich was very quiet on this election day morning, except for, in very Catholic Bavaria, the constant peals of Sunday morning church bells.
So we're just going to take a diversion along here. Let me know if I'm walking too fast. Just we've got a reasonable amount of ground to cover, and I don't want people to miss out on anything. The sequence of events occurred in the final week of the war that would seal the fate of 20th century Germany. On the 9th of November, 1918, the Kaiser had completely lost control of the country and had lost control of his army, which was beginning to mutiny. Realizing it was all over, the Kaiser fled Berlin. And in his absence, politicians in Berlin proclaimed a new republic, the first democracy in German history. 2 days after the revolution of November 1918, in the first ever act of a democratic German government, the new government formally recognized that the war was lost and signed the armistice, the cessation of hostilities that brought the First World War to an end. Why is that sequence so important? Because it meant that while it had been the Germany of the Kaiser that was responsible for the catastrophe that German people were living with, that had fought and lost the war, it was the democracy that replaced the Kaiser that actually signed what many Germans would later be taught to believe was a document of surrender and national humiliation. The new republic arrived just in time to take the blame for everything that it inherited from the old regime, and what it inherited was a mess. A nation on the brink of open civil war, a deeply divided country. The center ground of politics collapsed. You had the rise of extremes either end of the spectrum, forming private militias and taking to the streets of major cities to fight it out for the future. You had the growth of beer hall demagogues, whipping people into a frenzy and looking for convenient explanations.
While we were walking with him through a quiet alley, Brendan pointed to a fairly nondescript building and showed us the very place where Hitler got his start in politics.
This is our next stop, this sort of side alleyway. That building there, which as you can see is a beer hall. Used to be a beer hall, stopped being a beer hall, and then they just recently made it a beer hall again. Munich is the hometown of beer halls, beer gardens, beer cellars, beer everything. And traditionally, all cultural, social life in this city takes place in beer halls. Typical design of a Munich beer hall, at street level, you have the actual beer hall. And then one level above, normally, you have a private function room, which can be hired out for whatever you need, weddings, anniversaries, or politics. In those chaotic years following Germany's defeat in 1918, politics in this city went absolutely crazy. It's one of the most dangerous cities in Western Europe, believe it or not. And no part of Germany outside of Berlin was more severely affected by the chaos sweeping the country than Munich. Munich went completely over the edge. It had its own revolution parallel to the revolution in Berlin. Actually, it had one revolution followed by another coup d'etat, followed by another coup d'etat. It was very, very chaotic. At one point, it fell to the communists and was declared to be the capital city of the Soviet Republic of Bavaria. Many people believed that because of the chaos of Germany, it was widely expected that Germany was going to be the next Russia. What happened in Moscow was going to happen here. And there was a huge backlash, a huge reaction against that. The Soviet Republic was overthrown by those at the complete far end of the political spectrum. An extreme right-wing militia marched into the city, overthrew the communists, and unleashed a bloodbath, reign of terror.
I'm hearing some echoes of the last season of the podcast, specifically in the way that folks are reacting to the rise of socialism and what they perceived as just communism and authoritarian communism.
Right.
You and George talked about a lot of cities in the US that had implemented some form of proportional representation, resulting in more representation by class, race, and gender and political party. And in the US, that all got conflated with just, communists in the McCarthy era.
And in Germany, just democracy itself is conflated by the far right with a path to socialism. Except the difference is, in the US, the folks who were really afraid of socialism still liked democracy, and they were the established political parties, so they used democracy to make sure that their opponents couldn't gain political power. In Germany, the folks who hated democracy were the far right, and at the time, they were still a fringe party. They didn't have democratic power. So the only option they had to sort of express this anger at the democratic systems was through violence, using militias, mobs, and riots. And Brendan said that you saw that play out right there in Munich.
The people were being gunned down on the streets, and the bodies were piling up in the parks and gardens of Munich. This was the spring of 1919. So this is about 5 months after the war. Local people were caught in the midst of all of this chaos, and it really did feel to a generation of Munich people as if Germans felt the war never ended. Other countries moved on, began to rebuild, but Germans felt that they were trapped in this endless cycle they couldn't break out of. And the post-war peace settlement, the Treaty of Versailles, didn't really help. It was hated in Germany by everybody. And in particular, it imposed unpayable, brutal economic reparations that stopped Germany recovering and condemned Germany to this endless cycle of chaos. And in the midst of all of this chaos, at first unnoticed by anybody, a tiny, obscure, little political party was formed and began holding meetings here.
When Brendan says that this nascent political party was small, it really was. When someone who will end up being very important to German political history first starts going to this beer hall, it's estimated that they had fewer than 60 members total. And yet, this small fringe political party will start seeing its far-right extreme ideas make their way out of that tiny beer hall and start capturing the minds of people.
Beer halls, kind of the social media of 1920s Munich. I mean, this is before the era of modern mass communications, Obviously, TV didn't exist. Radio did, but no one had a radio. That was a luxury device. No one had any money. There was mass unemployment. It was a very young country. It's important in understanding this. Young men, a lot of whom were deeply traumatized military veterans. They were hanging out in the beer halls. You got them in the beer halls. It was your captive audience. And you could go to the communist beer hall. You could go to the conservative beer hall. Go to the liberal beer hall. everybody had their own beer hall. So you got whatever reality you wanted to hear about, depending on what beer hall you were drinking in.
It sounds like these beer halls were echo chambers of their time. And we see something similar today online with the algorithms that are showing people on the far right more and more extreme ideas and bringing them into the mainstream.
And it's in that context that you have this obscure group of eccentrics with their own little forum building a political party. At the time, it was called the German Workers' Party, but very quickly, they would decide to change that name to appeal even more broadly to the masses.
So they were a bunch of lunatics. I mean, hated the New Republic, pathologically anti-Semitic, and saw the first military defeat followed by democratic revolution for these guys. It's the end of the world. And they got to reverse both. And they were repeating a ridiculous conspiracy thing, but which unfortunately would come to be, I think, the most successful conspiracy theory in modern European history. Millions of Germans would later come to believe that this was true. I don't know if any of you have heard of the stab in the back theory. According to the stab in the back theory, what these guys were saying in their meetings here was, we never lost the war. The German army was never defeated. This was absolute garbage. The German army had been completely defeated. But they said, no. The soldiers were never defeated. They were betrayed. They were stabbed in the back. Who did the stabbing? Those who led the revolution that overthrew the Kaiser and declared this rotten republic that is working for the nation's enemies, liberals and socialists and communists. They have sold Germany to its enemies. This democracy actually represents foreign occupation of Germany. It's the shame of Germany. And one minority community in particular, I'm going to show you something ugly.
So at this point, Brennan holds up a political cartoon from the era, and it's a World War I German soldier who's aiming at the enemies of Germany. And standing behind him is this really racist caricature of a Jewish person who's literally stabbing him in the back. And that sort of encapsulated this mentality of these disgruntled men who this German Workers' Party was trying to appeal to, forwarding this conspiracy theory that this small minority of the population, Germany's Jewish people, that it's their fault that Germans lost World War I. Remember how awesome Germany used to be? We want to make Germany great again. It still would be great if it wasn't for those people. If, as they said, it wasn't for the Jews.
So that's the atmosphere in this beer hall here. But they were going nowhere. Until one day, 12th of September, 1919, stranger turned up in the meeting here, sat in the room, listening to what was being said. Nobody knew who he was. And the only reason he was there was because he was actually, believe it or not, spying on them. Military veteran, corporal in the army, recruited into a little military intelligence unit at the end of the war. And as part of his duties, his superior ordered him, attend the meeting here, check these guys out, monitor what was being said, and report back. So obeying his orders, he simply sat in the room to listen to what they were saying.
It turns out that this military veteran didn't just listen. In fact, he found some common cause in the far-right conspiracy theories that were being shared in that beer hall.
Corporal Adolf Hitler found that he agreed with what they were saying. Until towards the end of the evening, someone in the room said something that Hitler disagreed with, which provoked him. Shouted the guy down, "You're talking rubbish," and then launched into a spontaneous speech, which made quite the impression upon everyone else in the room. And they stunned silence. Who is that guy? And the story goes that the original leader and founder of the party, a guy since more or less forgotten by history, a guy called Anton Drexler, turned to a colleague in the room and said, "He's got a big mouth. We could use someone like that." At the end of the evening, Hitler was, leaving the room and may never even have been heard of again. But they stopped him leaving. They engaged him in conversation, got his name and address, and invited him to join the party. He wasn't sure. He actually thought they were a bunch of losers, but then he decided that's a good reason to join. We can dominate these people. Went to his superiors in the military and requested permission. And was given permission. And was even given They released military funds to him to help build up the party organization. Pause a moment and think about that. The German army in Munich was helping to pay for the construction of what was basically a terrorist organization dedicated to overthrowing the Republic. The German army was sworn to defend. German democracy was in trouble from day one. And his first job, he was placed in charge of propaganda, which he had a talent for, and was given a room to work from, here, a room above a pub. And within a few months, had become the dominant personality in this little organization and began to change them and ultimately turned them into the Nazi Party. The entire thing began right here.
Brendan even said he was only there because the German government was paying him to be there. There were just so many off-ramps, things that German society or government or people could have done differently to go down a different path and stop Hitler and the Nazis from coming to political power.
But they didn't. And so as Hitler's party attracts more angry young men and grows in prominence, he creates the brown shirts, the stormtroopers, this original Nazi paramilitary militia that's bent on backing their extreme ideas with violence.
And I want to emphasize paramilitary because they're not part of any official military. They're essentially violent political volunteers. The SA, or the brown shirts, will play a significant role in Hitler's rise to power, doing everything from disrupting opposition meetings to protecting his rallies to battling other paramilitary forces in the street.
But if there's one really big turning point that we need to understand, especially coming from our US context, it's the beer hall putsch.
Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933, but their first attempt was just under 10 years earlier in November 1923, in an attempted revolution that went horribly wrong. It's known as the beer hall putsch. Putsch is the German word for coup d'etat, an attempt to overthrow the government. It's called the beer hall putsch because it started in a beer hall. It's a huge beer hall at the other end of town that no longer exists.
And it's in this void of despair and anger and shame that so many people are feeling that Hitler finds his opportunity to act.
He was also coming under a lot of pressure. People have been saying to him within his movements, the speeches in the Hofbräuhaus are great. Are we going to do anything? And Bavaria itself was becoming unstable.
And all of this instability comes to a head in this relationship between Gustav von Kahr, the governor of the state of Bavaria, and Hitler.
And this guy, Gustav von Kahr, was playing a dangerous game. He saw Hitler and Hitler's supporters as a potential source of support for himself. And in his speeches, he would drop heavy hints that he agreed with a lot of what Hitler was saying. The first in a long line of German politicians who thought that they could exploit Adolf Hitler for their own purposes and found out too late that that's not how the game was played.
Not to put too fine a point on it, because Trump is not literally Hitler. Trump is not literally the same person. Trump is a different person who exists in a different time period than Hitler. But I'm hearing echoes here of the ways that Trump's authoritarian and anti-democratic leanings are being supported by other somewhat more moderate right politicians who think they can draft off his power. Again, echoes of history, even if history does not repeat.
Now, von Kahr essentially represented the establishment down in Bavaria, but Brennan pointed out that he made a critical miscalculation by being overly friendly with Hitler, this extremist, far-right upstart.
Von Kahr made the mistake of giving Hitler too much encouragement. And what happened was, in November 1923, von Kahr was making a big speech in one of the big beer halls on the outskirts of Munich, and Hitler basically surrounded the beer hall with his private paramilitary force, the brown shirts, marched into the beer hall in the middle of von Kahr's speech, fired a shot in the air, announced the revolution, stormed the stage, and kidnapped the governor of Bavaria. And said to von Kahr, I know you're on board with us. You need to lead us against Berlin. At this point, von Kahr is beginning to realize his mistake and is desperately attempting to calm Hitler down. And playing for time, agreed to join Hitler, never intended to keep his promise. And then it all began to fall apart. It was farcical, basically. Von Kahr escaped the beer hall, contacted the police on the outside world, go get those lunatics in the beer hall. Hitler found himself trapped in the beer hall, knowing the army and the police are on their way to get him, and in a desperate attempt to regain the initiative, gathered together all of his supporters and marched them through central Munich to Marienplatz, the historic centre of town, and then turned, which is at the end of the street there, we've walked a circle, and then turned and marched them down the street right outside, just where we turned into this building, heading for that large square, never made it. Got to the corner just there, and they had marched right into a trap.
Our group was gathered at the edge of a large square called Odeonsplatz. It's in the middle of Munich. It's on a small street right next to the Field Marshal's monument with giant imposing Bavarian lion statues. And it was right here at this narrow pinch point that Hitler's paramilitary forces were hemmed in and literally a bloody battle ensued.
The police were waiting for them. They basically marched into a kill zone. Ferocious gun battle. Hitler found himself trapped in the midst of a hailstorm of bullets. Everybody around him dropping dead. He wasn't touched. There's a story that someone threw themselves on top of him and took a bullet for Hitler, but you don't know if this is true or not. They mythologized everything. And Hitler made his escape, got into the back of a car, sped off. And the smoke cleared. 16 people were dead, four police, 16 Nazis, although that may have included an innocent bystander whom the Nazis later claimed was one of their own.
So this was a violent insurrection by a group of right-wing conspiracy theorists looking to overthrow the government and put their leader in power. I can't help think of January 6th here in the U.S.
The parallel is extremely strong, and our German historian friends and tour guides all saw it too. And it's not just the January 6th parallel itself on the day, but also the parallels about what comes afterwards. It was Germany's failure to properly punish Hitler for his attempted coup that actually allowed him to become even more powerful and even more popular in Germany, and it's what lays the foundation for him to come into power.
And within days, Hitler was arrested in his hiding place and put on trial, which ought to have been the end of the story. The reason why it wasn't is because the trial was a disaster for German democracy. Everything went wrong with that trial. For one thing, Hitler should have stood trial in a federal court in Leipzig. He didn't. He stood trial in Munich. He should never have stood. This is the last city he should ever have stood trial in. But the Bavarian government were deeply embarrassed by what had happened. They were implicated. He needed it all to go away. They arranged for him to stand trial in Munich, and the judge knew that he had a job to do. The judge saw his job as being to defend the Bavarian government, to protect it, and he was actually pretty sympathetic to the Nazis. He permitted Hitler to turn the trial into a triumph of propaganda. Hitler would speak for hours on end from the dock without interruption, turned everything on its head. Why am I on trial? I'm a war hero. I fought for my country in the war. I'm prepared to die to save this country. It's that rotten republic in Berlin working for the nation's enemies. They shall be on trial, not me. Journalists recording every word he spoke. And it electrified opinion in this country. This was the breakthrough. This is when Adolf Hitler became a national celebrity in Germany and indeed beyond Germany. Served less than 9 months in prison, was treated like a guest in a hotel, was given a book deal, wrote his memoirs, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. This became a huge bestseller, made him independently wealthy. And when he was released from prison, he was the figurehead for everyone in this society who, for many different and complex reasons, were unhappy with everything that was happening in Germany's fragile democracy of the 1920s and commenced his rise to power.
Okay, so now Hitler is really on the rise. He gets out of jail, convinced he is destined to be the next leader of Germany, to return it to a mythologized greatness that was lost when the Kaiser abdicated.
And ultimately, he saw democracy in the long term as a threat to his vision of Germany, of a Third Reich that would be a 1,000-year reign of Aryan greatness. But he could use the new system of democracy in the short term to achieve his goals. And he would do it as the leader of the Nazi Party.
And everything changed after that. Two things changed. After that, number one, Adolf Hitler was no longer interested in influencing more powerful people like the governor of Bavaria. He was the great leader. He was the chosen one, the man of destiny. And secondly, he declared no more revolutions, no more street battles with the army and the police. That's 19th century stuff. This is the 20th century. We do things differently. There's a fundamental weakness in democracy. Goebbels was very articulate on this point. It allows you to take it down from within. Hitler declared we are going to enter electoral politics and proved to be a very successful and actually quite sophisticated electoral politician. It's a long history. What the short version is, it was the Great Depression of the 1930s, the Wall Street crash and everything that followed from that finished off German democracy.
And the name of that party, Nazi, is short for National Socialist. It's a little confusing because you have people like the far-right party, AfD leader Alice Weidel, repeating this falsehood on X to Elon Musk that the Nazis were left-wing. They were socialists, but that isn't true.
Right, and this is all coming up because folks are rightly pointing out that the AfD and far-right movements have parallels to Nazi politics and policies, and so they defensively accuse the left of being the real Nazis. Folks on the right have often tried to argue that the Nazis were actually a left-wing party. They have socialist in their name, and socialist is a left-wing idea. It's always been sort of brought up as this argument from, reply guys and actually contrarians who want to say, I think both sides are bad. I think the extremes are wrong in the left and the right. They often, will say, the Nazis were actually a left-wing party. But recently, this has sort of broken out of 4chan and entered the mainstream as the internet and U.S. leadership has increasingly fallen to the far right. And we really want to emphasize the point that that's bullshit. The Nazis were never a left-wing party, and they were never considered a left-wing party back then or today.
The tiny little political movement Hitler had joined back there called itself the German Workers' Party. That needs a little bit of explaining, because it sounds very left-wing. They were actually far-right. But it was widely believed at that time that the future belonged to whoever got the blue-collar classes, the working man, on their side. And the idea was the German working class, the industrial working class, they're being hypnotized and seduced by the socialists and the communists. So patriots and nationalists had to win them back. And that's why they called themselves the Workers' Party. Hitler didn't really like the name. He didn't consider it sufficient. So he added to the name. Their philosophy, they referred to as National Socialism. Again, takes a little bit of explanation. When Adolf Hitler used the word nation, the word people, or the word Germany, he was not using those words as we would use those words today. Germany did not mean for him what America means to you. America to you means a country with flags and embassies and a constitution and laws and all the people who live there. That's not what Germany meant to Adolf Hitler. What Germany meant to Adolf Hitler was a race. It was all about race. He saw the world as a Darwinian racial struggle, endlessly fighting to defend the interests of the race within and without. The Nazis are the great racial supremacists in modern history. That's what it meant. And they used that word socialism because they would talk about more government spending for racially pure Germans. It was about appealing to those they thought were being seduced by the communists. But they were replacing class identity with race identity.
Brendan's partner, Nicola Hika, is a far-right extremism expert in Bavaria. She said the current far-right party in Germany, the AfD, has also been trying to argue the same point.
Yeah, and I asked Nicola specifically about comments Alice Weidel, leader of the far-right AfD, made in her interview on X with Elon Musk. Musk had vocally endorsed the AfD. Folks were saying, Musk's a Nazi, the AfD are Nazis, going up to the February election. And Nicola said that the AfD feels this need to distance themselves, distance their own current far-right extremist movement from the stain of Nazism. And so that's why it's so important to them to repeat this lie over and over that the Nazis were actually a left-wing party.
I think this started in a niche somewhere, started by Fox News in the United States, but it's also very popular in Hungary and other countries, where nowadays the far right is struggling with the Nazi heritage, actually. The Nazis called themselves the National Socialists. And yes, in the very, very beginning, they had a few socialists in that party, but the name comes rather from fishing from the far left. And over the time, they became clearly far right. But since it's called National Socialism, they actually now use this all over the Western world in order to say that this was a left-wing movement because people don't have their definitions right. If this was the case, how do you explain that all the prisoners in the German concentration camp system in the early years, 33 onwards, Dachau had like over 80% communists in there because the Nazis saw them as one of their main opponents. How would this go together if they were socialists? They would have rather wanted to cooperate. This is utter nonsense, and it is a narrative that has been out there, and it just shows the ideological background of Elon Musk and what is feeding into that narrative, actually, rather than anything else. But of course, after they debated this on the X Talk, it's all over Germany as well. It has been here, but not as prevalent as it is now.
Lies and manipulation of the truth to forward anti-democratic agendas. It's chilling. It happened in Germany in the 30s, leading to the Second World War and the Holocaust.
And it wasn't the only propaganda that the Nazis would effectively wield. We'll talk more about this later, but the Nazis, you may have heard, were known for their effective propaganda. But they also used political power. As we're going to see in this next episode, Hitler would very effectively use that framework of Germany's new and inexperienced democracy to completely destroy that democracy.
Well, one of their insights, the person who articulated it the best was Joseph Goebbels, who was in charge of propaganda. He said the great thing about democracy is the one good thing about democracy is that it gives you the tools with which you destroy it. You take it down from within.
The Future of Our Former Democracy is a production of More Equitable Democracy and Large Media. That's LARJ Media. Our producer-editors are Maria Paleologos and Isaac Kaplan-Woolner, with help from Corrine Kiltow. Sean Simmons engineered the show. Tina Knoll is principal and head of creative at Large Media. Fact-checking by Martin Lang. Special thanks to Faith Ombadi, George Chung, and Marty Reamer. If you like what you've heard today, please share this episode with someone you think needs to hear it. Personal recommendations are still the best way to get the word out. And of course, rate and review the show. It really does help. For links and more information on today's episode, check out the show notes at www.equitabledemocracy.org.
Brennan, I understand that you're part of the long line of English speakers with German partners who become tour guides.
Yes, it's basically, that's the story of just about every tour guide in this city, actually. Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah, it's a very common story. I mean, one tour guide, my favorite story, he no longer does it, but he was an Irish tour guide like me. And his story was, I came for Oktoberfest and never left.
All right.